So, Rick, we're going to turn things over to you. I want to give you a brief intro. I think many of us know Rick and Richard Wilk, who has been active in many different areas of anthropology for quite some time. He's a distinguished professor at Indiana University. He's also a provost professor emeritus, now retired not too long ago. He co-founded the PhD program in the anthropology of food and the IU Food Institute. He's spent a lot of time in Belize, done a lot of research there. He has a house there, has worked there for over 40 years. Most recently, he's been doing some work and visiting in Singapore. He is trained as an economic and ecological anthropologist. His research has covered many different aspects of global consumer culture, from the mundane to the quirky, I guess you could say, from an anthropological perspective. He's the author of too many books and articles to mention here. His most recent books that he's co-edited with, one with Emma McDonald, is entitled Critical Approaches to Superfoods, and the other with Shingo Hamada is the Seafood Ocean to Plate, which came out in 2018. The previous one came out in 2020. So today, Rick is going to talk about the super rich and their carbon footprint. And I guess we're going to get some lessons about what we ourselves should be doing in order to reduce our carbon footprint as the world gets hotter and hotter. So Rick, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Tim. I hope everybody can hear me okay. I'm really sorry about the technical glitch that kind of held me up in my presentation in May. But I think we have everything working smoothly now. I just want to emphasize that this research has been a team effort. And I've been working very closely with Beatriz Barros, who is a Portuguese graduate student, actually in archaeology. She's been kind of the lead author on most everything we've been doing. There's also a host of advisors and consultants who have helped us at various points along the way. Investigative journalism is not a skill that I was ever trained in. So I've been learning a lot about how you can dig out details about people using the web. I should also mention, I have had a helper in all these exercises, and that is my long-haired dachshund, Honey, who, as you can tell, I've just woken from a deep sleep. So I'll let the sleeping dog lie and let me get started, because I kind of want to get through this and get your responses. Let's see which one we're going to get. Can everybody see that?
Yeah, yes.
Okay. And it doesn't have a second panel on the right of it?
No.
Okay, great. Well, supposed to be great. There we go. This is just kind of the motivation and the reason why we really got this study started. Very much for me a post-retirement project, since now I don't have to worry about my university administrators being unhappy with my work, and Beatriz is still kind of under the radar. So this is where we are as far as the climate is concerned. The current level of atmospheric carbon dioxide is headed towards doubling within the next few years. I like to call it an uncontrolled experiment in what happens when you take a trace gas and double the amount of it in a planet's atmosphere. And now we're starting to see some of the results. The other trend which we've been following is that the wealth of the wealthiest people on the planet has just been skyrocketing, which is an indicator of the degree of global inequality. If you take the very top group of our census, you have a group of people who collectively own more property than most small countries, and seem to operate with impunity as when it comes to their behavior in the world. And the pandemic so far has been very, very good to the super rich. The other thing where I think atmosphere is different. Yes, we can get outraged that there are these super rich while so many people are destitute. But it's very hard for us to make the connection between one person's wealth and another person's poverty, given the complexity of the financial system and the global economy. Those connections are very weak and hard to trace. But unlike money, the carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere are emptied into a common pool from which we all take and give. And what that means is that when some people are emitting way more than their share of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, it affects everybody. And not only do the super rich do that, but their wealth also allows them to evade most of the consequences of climate change. So, if their palace in Islamabad is getting flooded, they can move somewhere else very quickly, unlike the other tens of millions of people whose lives have been destroyed by flooding in Pakistan in just the last couple of weeks. So we decided to try to take a look at the super rich and what their carbon output really is. There are really no previous studies to draw on. Almost all the accounting of greenhouse gases is comparing countries with each other, which of course gives you an average for a country. But the thing is, most of those numbers are pretty imaginary in the sense that a lot of the accounting is done by the emitters. So it's a company that says, well, this is how much we're emitting, and that gets added together with statistics on car travel and average emissions from cars, and you get a total for a nation, and then you divide it by the number of people. And those kinds of averages are notoriously inaccurate. And they mostly put the focus on the producers, the industrial producers of greenhouse gases, rather than the people who consume the products that are made in the process of production. So here's the kind of standard way that people think about inequality in greenhouse gas emissions. And that is looking at a country and saying, well, this is your annual CO2 emissions. And of course, you can see that there's a few countries that have high emissions, either because they have very high populations or because they have a high consumption lifestyle, or both. Or sometimes they look at per capita emissions. I'm sorry. And in those cases, you get a different group of villains but it's still a pretty abstract way of thinking about inequality, particularly because we know that the inequality in carbon emissions is enormous. And Oxfam is really the first place that's tried to connect wealth and emissions outside of the framework of comparing countries. And what you see is that, you know, just like the curve of population and wealth, the richest 10% are also responsible for almost half the total emissions by individual users. And this wine glass for emissions looks pretty much the same as the wine glass for wealth. And what you see is that the bottom 50% are really not making a major contribution to global climate change. And if you want to think about, you know, what those figures are in terms of tons per capita per year, the richest countries and the richest groups of people are averaging, like the United States, between 15 and 20 metric tons of carbon per year. And the very poorest countries, well, some like Nauru, the island of Nauru, are actually zero or negative in that they're actually fixing more carbon than they're emitting. But again, this is not very, it's abstract. It doesn't really point at individuals. It also doesn't kind of try to account for the within country inequalities. This is just some figures from the UK from 2006. And basically what you see is what you would expect, and that is that as disposable income goes up, the amount of carbon emissions go up. And I think what they've got there is CO2 in tons per household, starting at 15 and going up to about 45. But again, this is a kind of relatively small part of the curve. I mean, if you think about the millions of people who are in the military or incarcerated or in schools or other institutions, and then you think about, you know, like the British royal family, you're clearly missing both ends of this distribution. The other reason why we decided to look at billionaires is that you can't make a whole country feel guilty about their emissions. And this is very frustrating for poor countries who, in international discussions and debates about controlling carbon emissions, the poor tend to have very little voice, and the rich tend to show very little remorse or willingness to make any kind of drastic cuts that affects their lifestyle, particularly in the short run. So we're trying to kind of get people to think more about the relationship between wealth and emissions. We could have focused on that ultra high net worth individual category, an estimated 300,000 people who have more than $30 million in assets. But putting together a representative sample of that group proved to be pretty much impossible. Instead, we're presented with a kind of a pre-digested list of the billionaires on the planet. Every year, Forbes puts together a list and ranks them. And it turns out that many of the individuals are eager to be ranked high, so they're willing to reveal some measures of their wealth. our figures are all from 2018, which was the last year we were able to get reliable figures on all aspects of their consumption. But the number is, so when we did the study for 2018, there were about 2,040 billionaires on the planet. Now we're up to 2,670 odd people. And most of them have gotten richer and richer as time has gone up, although I guess the stock market decline has hurt some of the top people on the list. And if you want to put faces, well, it turns out that a lot of the billionaires, once you get out of the top 10, are pretty faceless. Most people don't recognize them. So we decided we would start with the richest and work down the list, trying to get as many of those people into our accounting as possible. That means that we only have a couple of women, and we only have a couple of people from outside North America and Europe, because Asian billionaires are much less willing to reveal their wealth, as are Middle Eastern billionaires, very unwilling to reveal their wealth. And recently, what we've seen in China has been a demonstration that sometimes it's good to be invisible, because some of the most visible have disappeared or had their fortunes limited in just in the last couple of years. So we wanted to start out with some theoretical background on what can be done about this. And in doing that, we draw on the economic and ecological and political anthropology that anthropologists have been putting together for the last century. And this anthropology tells us a lot about the ways that different societies have limited wealth and inequality, or have found ways of keeping some people from becoming vastly rich at the expense of others. So, you know, for instance, Fred Bailey's work on the gaining and losing of legitimacy among politicians, or he also wrote about the conversion of monetary wealth into political power. George Lakoff's ideas about the meanings of fairness also play a role. And then, as I'm sure you're familiar with, we have all these different discussions of leveling mechanisms, not just things like potlatches, but in many, I guess, non-modern states, confiscation and redistribution has been a very common thing for the powers in the state to, say, take endless loans from the Rothschilds and not pay them back. This is actually what's going on in China right now with the real estate magnates whose wealth is being confiscated and redistributed, but it's not clear who it's being redistributed to. And of course, periodic debt forgiveness. If you've read the Old Testament, you know about Jubilee years and the mandate that debts will be forgiven. Again, something that the United States has just tried in a rather undramatic way. But really, when you look through the ethnographic literature on how social order is maintained and how wealth is limited, a lot of it has to do with shame, and particularly public shaming. So that's something that I've been doing a lot more reading about. I think that we really need more research on shaming, how it works. And I'm always ready if you have suggestions of things I should be reading that will help me understand shame. The research that's been done in contemporary times in public policy and social psychology has looked at shaming campaigns, say furs, the shaming campaign undertaken by animal rights activists back in the 80s and 90s, which was for a time extremely effective. And so they say it needs a legitimate platform, good background research, careful targeting, and an offer of a remedy or goal, like get rid of your furs. Here's an example of effective shaming. This is what was called drought shaming during the 2014-15 drought in California, which is really the opening of the continuing drought they've had there. And some of these sites were set up by individuals and some by towns and some by newspapers and other public authorities seeking to encourage people not to water their lawns. And a lot of people saw this as a kind of opportunity to police their neighbors. And so people took pictures and posted them on the internet. Some people used drones to fly over neighborhoods and identify houses that were wasting large amounts of water. And there was even a campaign in LA in particular to look at the estates of the super rich and celebrities and call them out for using huge amounts of water. This was really kind of raised the issue of wealth, and if I'm wealthy, can I buy as much water as I want? And the answer is yes, if there's enough to go around. But if there isn't enough to go around, drought shaming may very well come to your doorstep. And it led to some major changes. So, for instance, Barbara Streisand responded by xeriscaping her entire grounds at great expense to stop using so much water. Oh, what's that there? There's also flight shaming. That's what was supposed to be on that slide. A campaign that started about 2020 in Sweden and has kind of gradually spread through Northern Europe, where people, particularly celebrities, but also politicians, and in at least a couple of cases, academics, who are being called out for their constant flights. Because in the daily life of an average middle-class person, the largest production of greenhouse gases is associated with air travel. One of my colleagues said that he had gone to his university travel office and got the records of how much travel each one of his colleagues had done during the previous year. And he wanted to post them, and his colleagues threatened his life if he posted them because they thought this was kind of an illegitimate prying into their affairs. At Indiana University, the travel office just flat out said, no, you don't have access to that, and we're not releasing it. It's not a public record. So we set out to do this for the super rich. And it's difficult because a lot of the super rich have very elaborate means of hiding their assets behind shell companies, for example, or keeping them in the name of a family member rather than in their own name. None of the kind of personal carbon footprint counters that are out there are applicable to people who have multiple dwellings or yachts or private airplane. And that's why we weren't able to do a random sample. So we picked from the top 50, and we went through a lot of public databases. We actually used Google Earth a lot because we couldn't measure the square footage. I mean, that was the way that we were able to measure the area of and size of billionaires' houses if we could find them and count their, we could often figure out how many floors there were in the house. And that gave us a rough measure of the size of their houses. But there was no way we could count the embodied carbon in their airplanes or in their houses because we don't know the materials, we don't know when they were built, we don't know what their use life is going to be. We could not account for their entourage because most billionaires don't travel by themselves. They have a posse around them. And they employ full-time bodyguards and publicists and a whole group of other people who travel with them. We estimated their dwellings by going to public records of ownership, and where we couldn't establish that, well, there's also a lot of billionaires who like to brag about their houses. So there are pictures and measures available that way. And then if we couldn't get any other way, we would use Google Earth and then convert that into carbon emissions based on heating and cooling demands, and then converting that, assuming that they were using either electricity or natural gas for their heating and cooling. The travel, it's possible to trace some private aircraft by using transponder data. It takes an enormous amount of time, and it's not terribly accurate because a lot of the time the plane is moving, but it's not carrying the particular person. Sometimes they're leased out or loaned out. So we basically figured out how much per hour they emit, and then we worked with a company that leases private jets to estimate the minimum amount a billionaire would use a private jet in a year. It turns out if you don't use your jet, it loses its airworthy certificate. So it has to be flown. I think it's 400 hours a year, which was our kind of baseline. All of these things were designed to come up with a minimum rather than, so that our figures are just bare minimums. The yachts, I could talk all day about yachts and super yachts and how much fuel they use and what their emissions are. That was by far the most complicated issue, was figuring out how much more a 100-meter super yacht emits in a year than a 45-meter super yacht. But we know pretty much the size of most of the very top. So here's just a few kind of weird things that we found out about billionaires. Of course, Queen Elizabeth died today, so I guess King Charles is going to be the one who owns 6.6 billion acres of land, upon which millions of people live and pay rent. John Malone, I didn't even know who he was when we started the study. Largest landowner in the USA, although lately large areas of cropland have been a favorite way for billionaires to exercise their wealth. Yeah, you can look down the list. Rising Sun has a crew of 45 and 2 helicopters. We went and we eavesdropped on the communication between the helicopter pilots on super yachts. And that gave us our minimum number of hours per year that the helicopter has to be used. Branson is pretty amazing. He's got houses literally scattered around the whole planet. My favorite is Bernard Arnault, who owns Indigo Island. And there are pictures of the island in various places, but it's not on any map and it's not on Google Earth. He's actually kind of managed to take his private property and make it impossible to find. We know it's somewhere in the out islands of Bahamas, but nobody can tell you where Indigo Island is, which is pretty weird in this day and age. So these are the results we came up with. Things have changed dramatically since we put out the study, since Roman Abramovich has been subjected to a lot of sanctions. He's sold Chelsea football, but he hasn't gotten rid of his yachts. Actually, Bill Gates, since we put this out, Gates has bought a super yacht. But in 2018, he did not own a super yacht. But what you see is the super yachts are the super emitters in this group. And it really doesn't matter how much time they spend on the yacht. Most seem to spend about a month, but at the peak of the pandemic, many of them were living aboard so they could isolate themselves in luxury. You know, this kind of international competition to see who can have the biggest super yacht seems to be on its way out now that so many of them are being seized by the US government and the EEC because many of them belong directly or indirectly to Russian oligarchs. Bill Gates actually not only bought a super yacht, but he bought a 160-foot yacht tender because his yacht was too big to get into the anchorage in Monaco, which is where so many of these people go in the winter. Then the boats go to the Caribbean the rest of the year. And the thing is, even when the owner is not aboard, they are fully staffed with a crew of up to 60, and they run all of the electronics, and they have to run up the engines at least for an hour or two a day. So there's, even if you're not using your super yacht, you're emitting huge amounts of CO2. And these are the kinds of dossiers that we put together for a top 20. Does anybody want me to go back to that previous list? Okay. Yeah, Xanadu, he was very public about it when he first started building it, but it's 6,000 square meters. This is like bigger than most hotels. 24, what do you do with 24 bathrooms? I really, it's, in fact, what Forbes tells us is that they like big houses and super yachts because you can spend a lot of money on them. Whereas, you know, lots of other things, it's also why they like kind of classically modern art. The actual amounts don't matter to you when you've got billions of dollars. You know, what are you going to spend $120 million on? You can't spend it on clothing and food, but you can certainly buy an island or two for that. So amongst themselves, they kind of, oh, is there something expensive I can buy that I don't have? They present to each other that this money is a huge burden to them. Some of the billionaires in our group make a lot of fuss about their green investments, like buying a 500,000 acres of forest, except that actually you might just be holding that old growth forest until the price of the lumber goes up. So you're not really sequestering carbon, you're just putting off the day that that carbon's going to be emitted. And say you're going to plant a forest. Well, those trees aren't going to be sequestering carbon for a long time. If the carbon you're offsetting is going to take 25 years to get recaptured, it's not really helping us very much at the present. And whatever their public stance, and Bill Gates does fly around the world talking about the dangers of climate change, where your money is invested makes a huge amount of difference. And I've been reading lately about finance and climate change, and it turns out that there's still, investors are pouring billions of dollars into fossil fuel infrastructure and exploration because it's going to be profitable. So on one hand, you may say, oh yeah, I've been funding Greenpeace or giving money to sequester carbon in soils. But that doesn't necessarily mean that your money isn't in the meantime working to promote more and more emissions that totally swamp what you say you're saving. And then there's a whole bunch of moral and ethical issues. You know, can I undo my sins, basically, is the question. And if you look at this cheat neutral video, it's hilarious. It was put together by a group of Oxford students, undergraduate students back 10 or 15 years ago. But it really does a great job of exposing the kind of loose logic involved in offsets. Yeah. So after we did this work, we tried to get the university to put it out in a press release, but they refused. The conversation was willing. We went through about 20 back and forth with the editor at the conversation, changing things and unchanging things. But when they finally put it out last year, we got 300,000 hits in the first day, which makes this project, like 50 times the number of references I've ever had in my academic career. And now we're over 400,000 readers on that. And behind that was a publication in a journal, Sustainability Science. And I can't tell you how many rounds of review we went through and interactions with the editor, but we finally got things accepted by the journal, and then they somehow sent the proposed issue of the journal on to Taylor and Francis, which is the company that owns the journal, as well as many others. And this came back to us that they have a defamation lawyer look through the paper. And this is their response to us. So they wanted us to take the names off because they were afraid of getting sued by somebody. And the UK does have some pretty wild defamation laws, which make London the kind of the home of libel and defamation litigation. The thing is, according to other lawyers that we spoke to, there is protection for scientific research in the UK defamation laws as they were amended in the 1990s. And then they kind of go on about how we appear to be aligned with negative voices who are asking, should billionaires even exist? And we have similarly negative views in later paragraphs. In other words, we're not billionaire positive enough in the paper. And there's a danger that we might be seen to have a strong position, which is kind of a shocking thing to be accused of by the publisher of a journal. Yeah. So they say that we have to add explicit statements that say that these people might be, our figures might be inaccurate, and that we're not trying to criticize any of these individuals. We're just, they may be making changes to their lifestyle. We haven't given them a chance to respond. So their idea was that if we wanted to keep the names in, we had to send letters to each of these billionaires saying what we thought their CO2 emissions were. And we refused to do that, and kind of threatened to make a big stink out of this attempt at censorship. So they wanted to, this was like their final offer. And we said, no, we're not going to anonymize the billionaires. That's the whole point. And we're not going to temper some of our negativity. I mean, what they want us to say, carbon emissions are not so bad, you know, that climate change is actually going to benefit many people by making them richer, or the plants are going to grow faster, or any of the other objections that have been spouted by anti-climate change science, quote unquote. So this is what the journal eventually published. It did delay publication for a while we went back and forth. And Beatrice was very happy to take first responsibility because she owns nothing. She's a graduate student. She has no money. She has no assets, and they're welcome to try to sue her. And hopefully I'll be dead by the time they would get around to me. This is kind of where we conclude and why we want to continue doing this work. Billionaires and celebrities model a kind of behavior. They represent a lifestyle that millions of people emulate. They present themselves as the winners of global capitalism. They do have a tremendous impact on the global atmosphere, just individually. You know, we figured if 2,200 billionaires are emitting at the average of our 20, that we're looking at the emissions of a whole group of poor countries, or a country like the Netherlands. So as a group, these 2,200 people have just an incredibly outsized impact on the rest of us. And then we have these issues that we want to explore further. And that is, does the fact that a billionaire is flying around in a jet make it less likely that I'm going to compost my garbage and turn down the thermostat during the winter? Does their example encourage the majority, discourage the majority to make changes? Finally, it's just a way of increasing public appreciation of where we are in climate change, and that this makes a kind of demonstration of the kinds of seriousness that we have to take when we approach an issue this big. So since this came out and the paper was finally published, we of course have had this global campaign about confiscating the super yachts of the Russian oligarchs. And this is exposed on one hand how huge they are and how, but also how difficult they are to track down. And now apparently the US government is kind of in a quandary about what you do with them after they're seized. Do you lay off the whole crew and let it sit in a marina somewhere until it rots? Or do you resell it to someone else who's going to drive it around and continue to dump thousands of tons of CO2 into the atmosphere? These things are bigger than some cruise ships. So we're not talking about, a weekend or a weekend voyage on a cabin cruiser. Another thing that happened just very recently is the controversy over the use of private jets for shopping trips of less than 40 miles by certain Hollywood celebrities. And this might have just kind of passed by a couple of years ago, but now it actually burst into a kind of internet fame in the short run, and got a lot of publicity, and kind of forced a number of these celebrities to say stupid things like, "Oh, I wasn't the one on board the plane. I loaned it to my friend to go shopping that day," as if that kind of undoes your culpability for the CO2 produced. So we were very happy. NBC News asked us to write something about Taylor Swift and Kylie Jenner, and what we're actually talking about is, again, is not so much shaming them, but making people aware of just how wasteful this is and how it affects the rest of us. And we've had lots of media contacts over the last few months, some of which have been very sympathetic. We spoke to a German documentary film group that seemed to think that we were on some kind of crusade to obscure our own wasteful habits. Another issue. And then this just came out 2 weeks ago. France, I don't really know what direct relationship it has with the drought, but the drought in Europe seems to have gotten people aware that climate change is affecting them in a very direct way. And the French government has been talking about banning private jets from French airports. And this would immediately ground a lot of the...
Hello?
Yes?
I'm watching this Zoom meeting.
If you're, please mute if you're talking to somebody.
I'm sorry?
Please mute.
Okay, I will. Right.
Almost done. But this kind of flight shaming clearly has an effect both on the billionaires' behavior, the celebrities' behavior, but also on public awareness of who's actually producing this CO2. So I'll stop the share. I think I ended close to the appointed time. Happy to answer questions.
Thanks very much, Rick. That's fascinating, really fascinating. So does anybody have any questions? I'm going to put the, let's see if I can.
I don't know how to do this. I just put my hand up, but are you aware of good studies of the social life of billionaires, what they talk about, what they say about the other billionaires, and so forth? The reason I'm asking is because my wife and I had a really big surprise about 5 years ago. We went to the 85th birthday party of one of our friends from graduate school, so it was like 10 tables of 8 people each. It was a really big event in their house. And they're as wealthy as the rest of them. Anyway, there were 4 billionaires sitting at our table of 10 people. And it was fascinating. The women were gossiping about one another in the same way that sorority girls would. It's just like the everyday life. And then there was a woman sitting next to me who looked like a very nice person. I said, "Are you from Lebanon?" And she says, "Well, I got my education in Lebanon, but my father was born in Saudi Arabia, and he and his brother they were basically Bedouins, and he and his brother walked 800 miles to the coast, and he got a business started. And now her share of the business is $18 billion. That's just a part of it. She's a very nice woman. I like her better than the others because there was some kind of authenticity to her. And it's also, the business was just, they just got a franchise to sell all kinds of consumer products, such as Coca-Cola. And in those days in Saudi Arabia, you could get rich just doing that. So I got fascinated by how ordinary these people seem in the way they talk about things.
Yeah, that's
and
a really.
Then they said to one said to another, "Oh, congratulations on your new job." And new job is being a CEO at one of the world's largest companies. And again, just like, oh yeah, everyday thing. My new job. We're making $900 million a year or some ridiculous amount. It wasn't that much. But. So it's very hard to study the super rich.
It is.
To understand them, we have to do that somehow.
Yeah, I mean, Laura Nader has been telling us to study up for a long time. I had a graduate student a number of years ago who spent most of a year trying to get in to talk to super rich soybean farmers in Brazil, and finally did get access, but it took him a long time, and it was quite a difficult process. There is an interesting book called Billionaires' Wilderness about the billionaires living in Montana and Wyoming by a sociologist. And there's also a woman, a sociologist in England, who did a thesis on, she spent a year as a crew member on a super yacht. But so far, I have not been able to get, I've written her many times. I haven't been able to get a response and find out where she is and get a copy. But Billionaires Wilderness is very revealing of this kind of bubble that so many of them live in. And the guy who wrote it said basically, I'm a white guy from Yale who grew up in Connecticut and went to prep school. So they just figured I was one of them. He basically said, if I had not been from that particular background, I never would have had access at all. But, you know, basically the group that he spoke to had very strong environmental values, which meant that they bought up all the property around them, didn't let anybody build housing for any of the people who worked for them, forcing the people who take care of them to live in the next county or 3 or 4 counties away in trailer parks and commuting hours every day to get to work. But there's a number of books about lifestyles of the super rich that I tend to find pretty boring. There's also a Finnish anthropologist who wrote a book about Pasi Falk, who wrote a book about lottery winners, people who won millions and millions of euros or dollars, and what they did with the money afterwards, which mostly seemed to be spent it wildly and lost most of it. Yeah, I would love to know more about Asian billionaires. When I was in Singapore, I spoke to people up and down the island trying to find out something about the super rich, and there was just no access. The lines were very firmly drawn.
Okay, Jim Wheel is asking, have any of the named billionaires in your article responded specifically to you, or have you heard from them anyway?
No. I think we're beneath notice. You know, and they're very well protected. Yeah, I don't think there's any possibility that we're going to get called on the phone by one of our billionaires. But I would love to talk with one.
Rick, did you have a question?
Just a comment. What you've presented is fascinating and really important. And I'm glad to see that you're not only putting it out in an academic journal, but that you've reached out to the conversation and you've gotten a great deal of response from that. In that respect, I'd like to give a shout out to Jim Weil's AAA session that is coming up this November on making a difference and reaching out. I think that one of the things that many of us in the session are going to do is discuss ways in which we have done research that could be important to the public at large, and what we can do or what we have done to varying degrees of success in reaching out and sharing that information with the people who can really make a difference. So thank you, and keep an eye out for Jim's session.
I'd like to do that. Thank you. My daughter makes a living as a writer. She writes for magazines and she's published a couple of novels, and she works full time trying to get access and trying to get trying to publish in the public eye. And it's hard. It's a very kind of, they speak a different language from us. As I'm sure many of you know, often they want a level of simplicity that does violence to the message. And that's a really difficult kind of balancing act to manage. So I do have to put in a plug for my daughter's novel called Oval, which is actually very anthropological. Don't tell her I said that. But yeah, I think we've had our share of anthropologists who have written for a public. I'm thinking, my old co-author Michael Schiffer has published 4 novels since he retired, but they're mystery novels. He's not setting out to change the world. I would really fear for the career of a beginning assistant professor who did this kind of outreach, because I think that tenure and promotion committees are still very conservative when it comes to these things. I've done a tenure review letter for someone who has written a great deal for popular outlets. And the kind of implication I got from the department chair was, help this person out, because they're probably going to get a lot of criticism at the college level, if not in the department.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's something that also has to change if we're going to be successful.
Dennis, how about you? Do you have a question or comment?
All right, Richard, that was fascinating, and your methodology of trying to narrow down your sample population was revealing, how difficult this is. But you said you had like 400,000 responses or hits or whatever on your one work, and I was thinking, thinking into the future, or maybe you've already done it, content analysis of the kind of points that people are making, and some kind of the public reaction to this could be an interesting kind of approach also to to put out in a more public way. But thinking into the future, some of these characters, Bezos, and they're creating spaceships. With the idea
Elon Musk.
Making these extra wealthy people go on trips that are only going to take 2 hours of weightlessness. So just calculating the carbon footprint of each one of those is, so for shaming, that could be something you get into. Yeah.
Yeah. I have done a little research into the carbon impact of rockets and space travel. And it's really interesting. NASA has always gone for the big bucks and has taken a very expensive strategy because they use liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen as fuel, because the waste is water after they burn. So they argue, I think very well, that they're not making a huge contribution, at least by shooting the rockets off. Of course, building them takes an incredible amount of carbon. But Musk, from the very beginning, said, no, there's handling those frozen gases is too dangerous and it's too much trouble. And he went for hydrocarbons. So his rockets have much more of an effect than anything that NASA shoots. So a lot of it is really about the details. You know, on the other hand, he says, well, but I reuse my rockets, so I'm not, and, you know, this accounting for that kind of stuff is beyond my skills and expertise. But it's clear that a lot of it is just about, you know, who's got the most money and who can have the most spectacular experience. Apparently, it's not even that much fun to go up in one of Bezos, not Bezos, in one of Musk's rockets. He is a really interesting case because he's sold all of his real estate. He's gotten rid of most of his possessions. He doesn't own a car. And he kind of makes a big deal about how his lifestyle is decarbonized, but most of the services are just provided by his company. So it's an accounting trick. And then because the cars are electric and his factory is designed to use very little non-renewable energy, he has a huge amount of carbon credits and he sells them to polluting companies so that they can claim to be carbon neutral as well. So virtue at that level can be very profitable. And I think he's been really a master at manipulating his public image. You know, like, I don't take vacations. I have working weekends on somebody's tropical island, but you know, it can make you cynical.
Sid, go ahead. Sid Greenfield.
Yeah, I just want to comment on what you said before about writing for the public. When I was a graduate student many years ago, some of my professors criticized Margaret Mead for just doing that. And this is one of the reasons she never got a position at Columbia. And we have taught our graduate students to write for each other. And we've developed journals that only other anthropologists will read. And now what you're suggesting, and rightly so, we have to go back about 3/4 of a century or more and undo all of this.
Yeah, it's, as far as I can recall, from very early in my career, I've heard people say, we need to get out more. We need to write for wider audiences. We need to build interdisciplinary connections. But it's one of those things where the kind of political economy works against it at every step. I was very proud at one point that it looked like I was going to have something come out in natural history, which used to be the kind of the place where anthropologists could publish semi-popular things. And the chair of my department at the time told me that it wouldn't help my tenure case, it would hurt my tenure case.
Exactly.
Brian Fagan at UC Santa Barbara is probably the most successful archaeologist I know who writes for a popular audience. And in writing our seafood book, I ran into oceanographers and people who do, fisheries. Many people who have read Brian Fagan's work on the history of fishing. And I don't think he ever got the kind of recognition from his colleagues that he really should have.
Yeah, but in terms of what you said about trying to publish this kind of research, that anthropologists contribute can contribute significantly to the trouble you had publishing it indicates that you can, archaeology is nice because people like that stuff and they don't take it seriously. And that's where we run into trouble.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think I've had, in my entire career, this is only the second time anybody tried to censor my my writing.
But keep it up.
Oh, thanks.
And we'll all have to do it.
Margot.
I'm just sort of brimming over with many different ideas, because what you have talked about today is really very fascinating. You talked about the yachts, the super yachts, being such outrageous, polluting objects. But in all these expropriations of these yachts, it's been cast in the public forum as we're punishing the Russians, we're punishing the friends of Putin
Yes.
for the invasion of Ukraine, which is a terrible thing. It's not, I know they use a lot of fuel, but you're the first person I've heard who talk about these super yachts as being really polluters.
Yeah.
All the other conversation about the yachts has been, we're trying to punish Putin's friends and get them to put pressure on Putin to change his ways on Ukraine and so on. So they're talking. It's the same issue, the super yachts, but they're talking about it in an entirely different way.
Yeah, there was an article in the New York Times this morning about super yachts and how much they cost, and not a single word about the impact that these kind of super artifacts have. It was much more about, it costs $3 million to get a stylist to do the interior. Kind of making almost kind of groveling to to the great luxury of these objects. But in some ways they are kind of like our pyramids, in the sense that they're super artifacts that cost more than anything else privately owned on the planet, and which have no particular function. They're just there to be there. And they glorify an individual, just like the pharaohs. So, in that sense, I think, just as a kind of going back to my archaeological background, if they're super artifacts that in some way really encompass a lot of the values of our society. I just wanted to respond to Laura's chat. Nobody has threatened my life yet. I have been subject to various kinds of accusations in Belize. Once, within a 2-week period, I was accused of working for the CIA and being a communist in the local newspapers. So that I don't know if they canceled each other out, but I have had some people really violently angry about the part I've played in land tenure cases, and in particular the Mayan attempts to get title to their lands, which has a lot of people just really, really angry. But I feel for you.
Cheryl asks, how do the super yacht emissions compare to ocean shipping?
That's a really good question. And I don't know the answer. I know that container ships have gotten bigger and bigger and bigger because that size makes them more efficient. And some people argue the same thing for yachts, except that the yachts are not cargo carriers, and they get heavier and heavier, and wider and wider. And I did a lot of reading about hydrodynamics that I found really difficult to follow, but it does look like as they get bigger, they actually do use less fuel per ton. But, you know, remember those giant container ships are everywhere, and they're constantly in motion, and they all have transponders, and you can, there are sites which track all of them, which I found really amazing. When I was in Singapore, about a third of of food that moves by ship goes through the Straits of Malacca and Singapore. And you just see it all day long, ships one after another. They have like traffic controllers. And that's an impact that affects all of us, that level of global trade. And the shipping industry, people are just, they keep talking about how they're going to decarbonize, but it's all pie in the sky, you know.
Yeah.
It's going to be liquid hydrogen, or it's going to be, you know, some other kind of exotic fuel cells, but
something magic.
Yeah, it's there's just no way you can drive ships of that size without burning something.
Rick, we've got we're almost, I think we're about out of time, but there's one last question on the chat screen from David. Maybe you can
oh, that's a great question.
What's the question?
The question is about shaming and how this is a style on the internet. He doesn't say, but it's also connected to the way that shaming is being used to attack people for sex transgressions. The Me Too movement is a movement that weaponizes shame. And what we've seen is that it's also a weapon that can be turned against people who are trying to have a voice. And Ron Johnson has a book, So You've Been Publicly Shamed, about where he talks about incidents of mobbing on the internet. And certainly when I've brought this up at conferences, people have said, no, we don't want to talk about shame because it's volatile and it's difficult. There's an anthropological literature on shame, but not necessarily on how you go about shaming people and how that shame works internally on people. There's a completely unrelated psychology literature. And to tell you the truth, I'm just starting to work my way through the literature on shame. But I think it's something really important that that we anthropologists have gone much further than other social sciences in thinking about its social implications. So thanks for that question.
And finally, Jim Weil says, can your research help tie into the intermediate and perhaps more approachable problem of addressing wealth inequality?
Yeah. Well, that's a tough one because, you know, under neoliberalism, countries kind of took off the caps and stopped taxing extreme wealth. And we're definitely living in another Gilded Age in that respect. But I think that there's a kind of rhythm to this, and that when it goes overboard the way it has, people start talking about taxing the rich again. And we've been talking about it, but so far I have not seen any real political will in this country to take it on. I have seen people in Northern Europe who see this as a crucial issue, because they used to have laws in several Scandinavian countries that limited the amount of the ratio between the highest paid person in a company and the lowest paid person in a company. And if you look at the people managing TIAA CREF, if you look at their paychecks, and you look where they're investing our retirement money.
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, it's kind of shameful. And there is a campaign to get TIAA CREF to divest from fossil fuel companies. And, I send them money, but right now we're more concerned about getting our graduate students to allowed to form a union right now, which has proved difficult.
Maybe what we need is another Great Depression, and when everything will go under, and then we'll be able to maybe reorganize it. And that's half joking.
Yeah, I understand.
Yeah.
Thank you. This was
thanks
great.
very much, Rick.
Yeah.
Thank you very, very much. And really, really fascinating.
Thank you.
Fascinating.
Oh, thanks a lot.
Yeah, we just really appreciate it. And I hope you'll keep us informed about how your research is going. And if you have any, I wonder if you could send me the link to the article that came out, or and then I'll send it out.
Pass it on. Yeah.
Yeah, so we could read that and see.
Definitely.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks very much, Rick.
Thank you.
Take care.
I'm so glad it worked out this time.
Me too.
Bye.
I was nervous.
Thank you.
Bye.
All right. See you soon, maybe in Placencia.